this idea of no I, no me. Sort of like associating different things, like looking at something and saying, well, that could have been me, or looking at, say, another animal and saying it could have been human, associating your own identity and an identity of your own, say, species, of your being, of your recognition of how intelligence works and how these things of awareness and self-awareness and how that very concept exists. I'm almost imagining a dog or some other animal transforming into a human, applying them, human characteristics to them, as if they're a dog and then they can be changed, or a cat, they can be changed, and that almost in a way can help with empathy and things like that, and how they can be changed into a human or things like that, and applying to that. Sort of like looking at a non-sentient cell or some kind of microbe or some kind of DNA thing or some kind of moving thing that's not sentient, or an atom or any kind of thing on a small level, and applying some kind of sentience to that thing, and how that you can apply it and you can recognize there's no I or me because there's nothing to project onto that microbe. It's moving around doing something. You almost want to apply a personality to it, some kind of human characteristics or characteristics of intelligence, applying it as if that thing can transform into some kind of human in a way that's true. Two things combine, two cells combine, and they create a thing based on the interaction between a sperm and an egg, and those things mixing together, and you have that mixture, and that thing on its own can't, but it can mix together with a different kind of cell. A female and a male can mix together and create something, unless it's asexual, and it can do it on its own, just multiply and split off and create an exact copy. So that's another aspect of that. But it's almost like applying your own being, your own not being, but your own understanding, your projection of understanding about intelligence, applying that thing, the sentient thing, having some kind of characteristics of me, or having a characteristics of applying it to a human, like the dog example or the cat example, turning into a human. You can applying that the dog could be human. What would that human look like if the dog turned into a human? But it's not. There's no me involved. The sentience, the brain processes. It's a dog brain. It's them. There's no plugging your brain into something, because it's all a physical process happening in your brain. This memory thing is the same process. Sticking little electrodes on your body and then transforming it and experiencing something through a computer or whatever. It's not the same thing as putting your sentience into something. You could feel something based on these things causing. You could say something based on where something is poking you. You poke a part of your brain and you say something, you react a certain way. That doesn't mean you can change your sentience or put your sentience into something else like a machine. Sort of like applying that same concept. You can't apply a dog and say they're going to be human, because the process of the dog is just a mechanical process, just like a human's a mechanical process. Any living being, like any other a non-sentient being, is just a mechanical process, and that goes to the idea that there's no me or I. Sort of like back to the question of why am I me and not someone else? Because there's just a projection of you. You're just an experience. You're just this thing, these interactions moving, and there's this projection, this circumstance, this effect that happens to have a circumstance where there's a projection moving out of you, and that's the only distinction. And there's no me or I, because you're just a process, of mechanical process based on something. This whole me of I, why am I not him? Because you're just a projection. You're based on this mechanical process, based on this thing that was created by the crude mechanisms that caused this the crude mechanisms that caused something to exist to begin with, based on all these different processes leading from interactions, based on this vague concept of cause and effect, leading up to this process within processes, leading to another process. And back to the example of the dog thing, it's a dog. You imagining what that dog would look like if you gave it a human serum, or you kiss the dog like kissing the frog prince and turning it into human, doing that kind of thing. There's nothing beyond, say, the dog that you're looking at. You can imagine him being human. It's in your head, but the reality doesn't change around you based on your reality. Obviously, all you have is your perception. And your perception is part of this reality, and all you have is your perception, so it means something. It's in this reality. But outside of this reality, the dog is still the dog, even if you weren't there, and that makes a distinction without your projection, even though the projection is the only thing you have. And your psychology is the only thing. You look through your psychology, your perception, based on this awareness, the sentience, and interaction with this environment based on these interactions, causing the sentience to react in certain ways. It's the environment that creates what it is. Sort of like you, when you're eating, you experience the pleasure in and of yourself. It's not the food. The food has just an interaction that you have, and you're experiencing it of yourself. And it's not the food causing it. The food is a component, but it's not. The feelings are coming from inside of you, the satisfaction, the fullness, the tasting based on your tongue, the senses that you have, all these interactions. Sort of like the dog doesn't need you to be there to project the idea of him being the idea of him being human. The dog's still the dog, and it's not going to be something else. And the same thing can be applied to them. They're just a mechanism even more controlled by the choices and the mechanism that's controlling us. They're even more. Even though we're all at the whim of this crude mechanism controlling everything, interacting. It's based on the interactions, based on certain circumstances that lead us to a certain way, sort of like the intelligence leading up to certain things, me doing a certain thing, someone else doing a certain thing, leading into all different kinds of possibilities. And obviously, it's from our point of view where we start seeing an openness, where we think that anything could be possible. There isn't me. I'm moving around. I am obviously moving my hands. I can think about it. No, you're not thinking about it. Your thoughts are then in and of themselves a process of this thing. They come from somewhere, and it's not this me thing. There's no person inside of you. Then there's a person inside of that person. And who's controlling the person? Obviously, there's a person, a metaphorical person of these processes moving around in one, creating a final outcome. Just like there's no equilibrium leading to a final outcome. It just happens to be the outcome, and the outcome, you being alive, experiencing this thing, is based on the negative deprivation, this zero-sum game in life, and there's always a trail of blood or a trail of tears leading up to something, and you just happen to be it. That doesn't mean there's an equilibrium. You're applying a vague concept to an idea of something being here. You're experiencing it based on the whole concept of the idea of what's happening, a zero-sum game leading up to where we are now, and there's always going to be a trail of tears. That's how we get to where we are. That's how we progress. The progress is from the beginning to the end based on these interactions, which are based on these deprivations leading up to some kind of future event or a future end, inevitable end. And that's the only thing. That's the very concept of being alive, is the concept of moving from the past to the future, jumping, and then sort of like the sandwich idea, we're jumping, and then whatever happens, it doesn't matter, just based on the momentum of existing, based on the circumstances, and something landing, like an example with an example based on the existence that we're experiencing. And everything that happens in between doesn't mean anything until there's an end. It's based on this momentum that leads up to that. Yes, so there's no... there's no I, there's no me. It's just a projection based on these crude mechanisms, and there's just a projection it's a projection, it's the sentience that means something. The feelings only mean something because it's part of the biology that has a mechanism control over the sentience. Without this body, it really wouldn't matter, and without this mind, the body wouldn't matter. So it's a symbiotic relationship, but obviously it's all in one. It's all a physical process. You can't separate the mind from the body because the mind's part of the brain. It's a pretty simple concept. It's not complicated. You can symbolize it maybe in some other program. Okay, this is the way this person's thinking based on these different programs happening, but it's a physical process. It's not happening on the same level, say, computer, but it's similar enough that you can draw comparisons and analogies through something like that. So there's nothing more to it than that. Applying it to some non-sentient thing, like imagining it moving around doing the same processes, but it's still not a thing that's a living. You see it moving around doing something, and you apply it almost the same thing as the dog example, but it's nothing more. And back to the idea of a trail of tears. Yes, I want to make sure I get this idea complete. The trail of tears leading up to where we are now. And that's the very idea. Sort of like living is based on this thing where it's deprivation, and you don't want context other than the context of satisfying a deprivation, only go back to it, but that's the only thing we're doing, and the context of not existing. And then when you want context, when you're at the zero sum, when you're finally satisfied. But that's the very idea, that's the very definition of the zero sum, is when there's nothing to feel. And when you're not existing, when you want to feel, is when you're not feeling and can't feel, because that's by definition the exact thing, that's the thing that's happening. So it goes back to the whole idea. And it doesn't need you to be there for it to be experienced or anything like that. You don't need to be there for the dog to exist. It's still existing on the same level. It doesn't need your projection, even though your projection means something to you. It's still in this reality. It's still happening. It's something that ends, and it doesn't need, that reality doesn't need that projection to be part of the reality for the reality to still exist in the way it is. Obviously, it has an effect and so on, but it doesn't need you to have the reality still moving around you, sort of like it didn't need you to have a projection or an opinion all the time before you were born and after you die. It's not going to need you. Obviously, the universe ends once you die to you for perception, because there's no context. Or like sleeping before you have a dream or whatever it may be. There's no context. It's instantaneous. And it almost begs the question, well, what if it happens again? What if I just wake up again? Even if it's not, applying metaphors and analogies like someone waking up in some other country experiencing something else. It's obviously a scary prospect when you think about it, when you recognize it, but you almost have to put yourself at the whim, like saying, well, what's going to happen is going to happen. And if it's this regression thing, or at least based on a concept when you're alive, experiencing, some kind of discomfort and recognizing that based on a perception, it can kind of be detrimental to your psychological well-being, almost make you insane. So yeah, there's no I or me. It's just this interaction with this projection. Why am I not someone else? Well, there's no why am I. There's just interaction. Why am I not from the point of view of someone else? Because you just happen to be the point of view of you. You just happen to be out. Why wasn't I born this person? Why wasn't I them? Why am I not through their point of view? It's this. You are just an interaction based on a process leading up to something happening. You're just another piece, another fungus. You're just like on a universal level. You are just another. You look down. You look at fungus growing on cheese, and sort of like we're the fungus growing on Earth, and then. Where this Earth is a fungus on the solar system, and these little pieces and things growing on each other. We're essentially the fungus of the Earth, and it. So yeah, we're just a process. We're a byproduct. This sentience is a byproduct of just a machine moving, interacting, sort of like a microbe or just a simple cell interacting on a smaller level on us. We're just like the cells on the Earth, making up the Earth, moving around. You look at individual pieces, you see the lights moving around and all those things. It's still a whole, but you see the individual pieces moving around, sort of like the individual pieces in the dirt. Everything, not just us, but everything else is a part of this Earth, and this soul, and this this planet, and this yes, Earth. And so like the no I and me, it's just interaction. In the sentience, this projection, you had to be someone if you're going to exist. There's no one else that's going to exist if they don't exist. There's not infinite number of people that could exist. It is what it is now, and it's going to happen a certain way, and the way it happens is the inevitable outcome that's going to happen in the future, leading from something in the past, fleetingly leading to something in the future, sort of like the past fleeting into the future, the thoughts processes fleeting into the future, forgetting it, becoming a thing of the past, becoming nothingness, only remembering once you forget, remembering that you forgot something once you remember it again. The context of being applied to the same concept of death, only knowing that you were dead once you were alive, and not knowing the context when you're dead, but knowing when you're alive, and the zero sum when you're dead and when you're alive. So you happen to be, based on this mechanism of crude forces creating an interaction and leaving this sentience, this nerve endings at jeopardy, this sentience, this awareness, this perception at the whims of the crude forces. And since your whims of the crude forces, even your own crude forces being blocked in by these crude forces, you're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Sort of like you're stuck. You're a thing inside of a thing based on crude forces. You're aware, sort of like any other sentient being would be aware of something else happening around them. It doesn't need you to have existence inside this reality. It just exists in of itself in your projection. Though important, doesn't need it. The reality doesn't need your projection for something to exist outside of yourself. In a certain way, in a certain mechanism, based on the smaller mechanisms, it's working on a very base mechanism on the lower end. And even if weren't existing, things are just atoms and things on a smaller level. Bring it to a bigger level. The bigger the level, and the more rational level you're speaking on, the simplistic level, you're getting more irrelevant. And the bigger level, you're more relevant based on this process that you're working on. I'm obviously relevant when I pick up a piece of paper. It's relevant on my level, but all the atoms and cells aren't relevant unless it's knowledge that I'm using to inform myself of something. But on this smaller level, I'm not picking much atoms. I'm picking up a piece of paper. Nothing more, nothing less. So, yeah. I think that's it. Anything else? So yeah, just crude forces bumping around, causing, and you just happen to be, why am I not someone else? I am who I am, because there's no me to be who I am. I just happen to be sentience coming out of this mechanism, based on the mechanism, on this moving piece of meat, based on this mechanism that created the thing to begin with. So I'm not them and they're not me, because there's already someone them, and I happen to be me, and there's separate entities based on a whole entity, based on the reality that we're living in, based on the crude forces that cause them to happen. I think that's a good enough way of describing it. Obviously, maybe not the best way, best words to describe it, or the best articulation, but I described it basically to the point. I didn't go into enough detail, but it's fine. So that's all I need to say. So thank you, and until next time, bye.